Mr Speaker, I support this bill.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am a member of the Social Services Select Committee, but unfortunately I can't remember hearing the submissions. I wasn't in the Select Committee at the time, but this Social Security Fraud Measures and Debt Recovery Amendment Bill, which is having its second reading, it's my pleasure to inform the House that Labor does support the bill, but we have grave reservations. I do want to pick up on what the previous speaker has said, that we need a welfare security system that helps people when they're in need, but we actually do see this as beneficiary bashing, and I will provide a context for not only the House but the people at home who are listening. So when you look at the problem definition in terms of this piece of legislation, it seems that the problem is there's $20 million of spouse, partner, beneficiary fraud in New Zealand. So that's the context. From our perspective, we've looked at a parallel, issue, which is tax fraud, which is a deliberate act, and that totals $141 million. So from our perspective, we question why this government always seeks to attack and to criminalise those most vulnerable, which is the point that my colleague Rajan Prasad raised earlier. So from our perspective, this is a piece of legislation that is going to target and stigmatise those most vulnerable. And picking up a statistic from my colleague Jan Logie, who also sits on the Social Services Select Committee, we're talking about about a third of the fraud that's committed within the social welfare budget. So from our perspective, what are the big issues that we have? And I'd like to quote from our minority review, which is in our Select Committee report. And it actually comes from the New Zealand Law Society. And so I'd just like to quote that they say it's, and I quote, "It is fundamentally unjust for a beneficiary spouse or partner to be liable for the full excess amount that the beneficiary obtained by fraud, regardless of the spouse or partner's benefit, and that limiting recovery to the amount by which the beneficiary spouse or partner benefited would provide a more equitable outcome for the relationship fraud." So from our perspective, to link the fraud of an individual, because in New Zealand only an individual can receive a benefit, to fraud perpetuated by that individual's spouse or partner is fundamentally unjust. And we say it's fundamentally unjust because it actually departs from general principles of criminal law. And so from a legal perspective, there has to be a positive act to then determine a criminal activity has taken place, and there has to be knowledge of or failure to report another's offending, which is another ground for it to be seen as a criminal offence. And our contention is that there is already a number of existing criminal offences that cover the criminal liability of spouses or partners or beneficiaries. And so some of the things that beneficiaries have to do is, in terms of that positive act, is to agree with the beneficiary that the beneficiary will commit a fraud. So we're actually talking about collusion between two people for a fraud to have taken place. They have to encourage or assist the beneficiary to make false statements in order to obtain a benefit or rate of benefit by fraud. They have to make false statements for the purpose of assisting the beneficiary to obtain a benefit. They have to omit to inform MSD when questioned on matters. And this then points to the submission by Craig Brereton, who is the co-convener of the National Beneficiary Advocacy Federation of New Zealand, who said, and I quote, "While we support the idea of making both parties to a fraud liable for any debt relating to fraud, where a relationship in the nature of marriage is proven, we are very concerned at the removal of the requirement for investigators to first seek information from the parties under investigation." And so in terms of a natural justice perspective, we are really concerned that there is no investigation now. We deem that benefit fraud has taken place, and so if you're the partner of the beneficiary who has committed that fraud, you are all of a sudden linked to that crime and you have no recourse. The presumption of innocence actually is a legal principle, and so I do want to highlight that in terms of my kōrero tonight, that the burden of proof should be on the ministry, not on the person who has been charged with the criminal offence. And so this for us is a deterioration of the relationship that the state has with beneficiaries. People who seek assistance from the state, I believe, don't do so because it's a lifestyle choice. I believe that they need support from the state because they find themselves in circumstances beyond their control where they need income so they can pay their rents, put food on the table and fundamentally look after not only themselves but in many instances their children. And so this piece of legislation, I contend, shouldn't have been a priority of this government. It would have been a much better prioritisation of this House's resources if we'd actually looked at the $141 million in tax fraud that's committed every year, because that's a deliberate act by wealthy people to not pay their fair share. The context of this piece of legislation is the most vulnerable people who are receiving support from the state being penalised for circumstances that they find themselves in. And I think that is the biggest critique of this piece of legislation, and the biggest critique I can make about this government, is that they like to kick the most vulnerable. They like to stigmatise, traumatise, make them feel like they are undeserving. It is actually, it is. And if you look at is it a just treatment of beneficiaries? Does this process create a genuine respect for the people who find themselves needing welfare? The answer is no. It's absolutely no. And so the prioritisation of this government always should come into question when pieces of legislation like this come into the House. Because it seems to me that if we wanted to pursue fraudsters, we would go after those who are committing tax fraud. But that's not a priority of this government, because that would be a lot of people they know, wealthy people. It is their mates. That's right. And that's the issue that I have with pieces of legislation, and our side have with pieces of legislation like this. I mean, at the end of the day, people in need to be supported. People in need don't need to be further traumatised and stigmatised through pieces of legislation like this. So I will continue as a representative of communities most in need to ensure that we have respectful working engagements with them. We are supporting this bill as a Labour Party because we believe that those who commit fraud should be held accountable. But the equity that we seek in terms of holding people accountable should extend to the fraudsters who are committing tax evasion. Kia ora. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Tim McIndoe.
Mr Speaker, my integrity and motives as an MP were attacked earlier in this debate